One of the harbingers of the end of the legislative session is the annual State House outdoor cookout that is sponsored by the contractor who runs the State House cafeteria, the Abbey Group of Enosburg Falls, Vermont. And Ray, the longtime chef in the cafeteria, is the person who started bringing the cookout outdoors on a beautiful spring day when the daffodils, or at times the tulips, are just beginning to bloom out on the State House lawn. And we can tell that the legislative session only has weeks to go, perhaps even just days. So the fact that this year's barbecue cookout is happening is a good sign to most of the inhabitants of the State House as they chow down on barbecued chicken, pork, ribs, hot dogs and hamburgers, along with the requisite salads and even a few veggie burgers for those in the crowd who can't eat meat.
Well, hello, I'm David Zuckerman, Lieutenant Governor. I've been on this program a number of times, although not as much this year, so I apologize. It's tricky for Rick to find me all the time. Sometimes I'm zooming around the state, visiting with folks. Had a number of town halls this year with Rights and Democracy, Planned Parenthood, NAACP, and numerous other organizations from Rutland to Bennington, up into St. Albans, down in White River Junction, Bellows Falls, Montpelier, Hardwick. I think there was another one or two in there. Visiting with folks, talking about what is an economy for all going to look like, and how do we get to an economy for all, meaning folks do work hard. They deserve to get paid enough to pay their basic wages and pay their basic bills, I should say. And we used to have a society that did that. But we've been moving away from that really ever since Reaganomics, where it's been squeezed more and more out of workers and work more and more towards profits on Wall Street, and not as much towards how, if we all do well as a whole, then we all do better. And so a lot of us are talking about how to try to move back in that direction of a mentality that you deserve good pay. If you work hard, you show up for 40 hours of work a week. So things like raising minimum wage, we're here at the home stretch with minimum wage and paid family leave. So far, we haven't found the magic way to get through on those, but critically important that workers' wages go up faster than inflation to try to start digging out from the hole that's been created from stagnant wages for decades. Reaganomics was supposed to be trickle down. They keep cutting taxes for the wealthiest, but if you actually look at the result, you've got a few people with concentrated wealth in the gazillions of dollars, and most people are struggling to pay their bills. So this Kool-Aid that has been offered since Reaganomics of if we give more money to the wealthy, that'll create more jobs and people will be better off, really hasn't turned out that way. And most people are really struggling month to month to pay their bills. So I think a lot of people are looking at that again, either from presidential candidate perspective right down to here at the state level. Clearly, climate change is also, and climate crisis, frankly, is a major issue that we need to address. And we're doing some steps here in Vermont, but frankly not to the scale that I think we need to be doing it. I know there's naysayers out there that say, look, Vermont already doesn't create that much. We're more of a sink than a producer because of our trees. And I think that's a convenient answer, but not one that really accounts for all the production of CO2 that Vermonters have done over the last many decades and centuries. And at this point, do we want to rely on other people maybe doing their part, or do we all do everything that we can? And so I would like to see us do a lot more around weatherization, a lot more around rural broadband so people could work from home more frequently. We could get good paying jobs in Vermont with people who work electronically from southern New England. That might attract some younger families to be in Vermont as well. We need to build more affordable housing in Vermont, and we're always struggling to find a way to take out more debt to do that. I'd say let's stop taking out debt and let's start doing it with the current dollars we have. The wealthiest 10% of Vermonters got about a $300 million tax cut from the Donald Trump tax cuts for the wealthy, further Reaganomic thinking. I would argue for the next 5 years, let's take half of that, which is about $150 million a year, and invest it in Vermont's infrastructure. Not ongoing expenses, but rural broadband, weatherization, solar installations on working class people's properties so that their bills would go down, give them more money to spend in the community. You know, we could do more around transportation and alternative transportation. We could do more around paying down a few years worth extra $30 million a year towards the teacher retirement fund so that the state would be on more sound footing and we would free up annual dollars in Vermont for the basic needs that we have in Vermont. So I'm talking about a 5-year plan to recapture about half of the federal tax cut and have it go into Vermont economic investment, infrastructure, and climate crisis mitigation. So those are the ideas I'm throwing out. They're all over the state. They're pretty bold, they're pretty crazy, but actually, if more people think about it, I think it's a real opportunity for the next 5 years to rebuild Vermont, not as a permanent tax increase, but a temporary one that would be all about infrastructure in Vermont for our future. So there we are, we're in the home stretch. Not enough's getting done. Hopefully we can do more in the future.
Hello, I'm Representative Brian Smith from Derby, Morgan, Charleston, Holland, and Brownington. I represent Orleans District 1. I want to address Proposition 5, which was passed by the House yesterday, of 120 to 30 approximately. I was one of the minor votes. I voted no on this proposition. It involves the change of the Constitution to include a woman's rights to whatever she decides is appropriate for her, including an abortion. I oppose this bill strongly because of the language that it's going to be sent out to represent what the majority here believe is the way it should be. It's not clear language. I believe that it should be clarified so that all Vermonters will understand what the intent of this bill is. This proposition, once passed by the state voters will get a chance to vote on it. What's going to happen if it passes, it will allow a doctor to perform an abortion on an 8.5 to 8 3/4 month fetus that's still in the womb, to go into the woman with stainless steel, yank it out, and throw it away. I don't like that. I don't think it's right, and I think Vermonters need to understand exactly what this bill says before they vote on it. Thank you.
Hi, this is Representative Ann Pugh, Chair of the House Human Services Committee, and I'm talking to you on Wednesday, May 8th, which is the day after the House passed Proposition 5 on the House floor with a vote of 106 for it and 38 against. I want to talk to you about why I brought Proposition 5 to the floor and how important it is for people in the state of Vermont. But first I want to read what Proposition 5 is. Proposition 5 states, "The right to reproductive liberty is central to the exercise of personal autonomy." This is part of what we said was the purpose. So I'm first reading the purpose section, which is the right to reproductive liberty is central to the exercise of personal autonomy and involves decisions people should be able to make free from compulsion of the state. Enshrining this right in the Constitution is critical to ensuring equal protection and treatment under the law and upholding the right of all people to health, dignity, independence, and freedom. So now let me read you what would become Article 22 if it proceeds all the way through the system. Article 22, with the heading Personal Reproductive Liberty, says, and I quote, that the people are guaranteed the liberty and dignity to determine their own life's course. The right to personal reproductive autonomy is central to the liberty protected by this Constitution and shall not be denied or infringed unless justified by a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. Now, amending the Constitution is a serious endeavor. The Constitution is where we declare our basic principles of democratic government and fundamental rights. That said, the Vermont Constitution is meant to be a living document, And in itself, it provides for its own amending. And Vermonters have amended the Constitution many times in history. The last was in 2010, when the constitutional age for voting was lowered to 17 if you were going to be 18 by November. The amendment process outlined in the Vermont Constitution requires approval by the General Assembly, that's both the House and the Senate, in 2 consecutive bienniums. In other words, not next year, but the year after. And that's followed by voter ratification. So this proposal will come to the voters. According to the Constitution, the Senate proposes the constitutional amendments, and the House has to concur by a majority of its members. In a vote of 106, the House more overwhelmingly approved this amendment, since a majority of the voters would be 76. House rules then outline the process by which this body, the House, considers the Senate's proposal. First, the proposal has to come to the committee that has the policy jurisdictions. In this case, it's the committee that I chair, House Human Services. By our House rules, the committee has to hold a public hearing, which we did, where 50 individuals testified and provided both written and then some in addition, written and oral communication. And of those 50 individuals, 25 were in support of the moving forward and 25 were against. The House Human Services Committee received from the Senate Prop 5 on April 9th. We had our hearing, our public hearing, on April 17th. We voted it out favorably on April 26th. And between April 9th and April 26th, we had 7 meetings where we heard testimony from lawyers and representatives of both Right to Life and Vermont Dignity, as well as Planned Parenthood, as well as the Attorney General, and people like that. Next, according to House rules, the proposition has to stay on what's called our House calendar for the notice for 4 consecutive days, which it did, in order to give everyone an opportunity to read it. And then on the 5th day, which was yesterday, we bring it up for action. Ultimately, again, just to reinforce, if it were to pass in the next biennium, both the Senate and the House, it would go to the voters. And for those of you who are wondering, want to put it on your calendar, it goes to the voters in the election year of November in 2022, and that is, I forget what day it is, I'm sorry. What will come before the voters is their decision, your decision, as to whether one's personal reproductive autonomy. Now, what is that? That's the right to choose or refuse contraception, the right to choose or refuse sterilization, the right to choose to become pregnant, and the right to choose abortion. Whether that is a fundamental right to be protected unless regulation is justified by a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. Since 1992, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Well, since 1992, U.S. Supreme Court decisions have begun to dismantle Roe v. Wade. It began by changing the standard of scrutiny used by the court to analyze state laws imposing restrictions on a woman's right to choose. What's happening now? 4 states already have constitutional abortion bans in place if the court overrules Roe v. Wade. During 2018 alone, 15 state legislators enacted 27 new state law restrictions, bringing the number to 424, the number of abortion restrictions enacted in the last 8 years. 23 of these new laws take aim at abortion. The remaining 4 restrict access to family planning, and 5 states seek to ban even first trimester abortions. In Proposition 5, we have the opportunity for enhanced protections and liberty in the Vermont Constitution and bypass what I just tried to show you, the now unreliable protections found in the federal Constitution. Prop 5, for those of you who are constitutional scholars, has been developed in the same vein as Article 11 in our Constitution. What is that? It safeguards individual privacy against search and seizure. And Article 7, which we call our Common Benefits Clause, which has been interpreted twice in the last 25 years, once in 1997 to provide equality of educational opportunity, and then again in 1999 to provide protection to same-sex couples who sought the benefits and protections of marriage. All of these cases were decided under the Vermont Constitution without reference to the U.S. Constitution. And so the job of the House was to determine whether the Senate did their due diligence in writing Prop 5 language and took testimony, and whether the language is in fact ready to continue its path through the constitutional amendment process, which ultimately leads to, remember that, you, the Vermont voter, in November 2022. And the House Human Services Committee and I think it does. And it builds this on the basis of Article 1 of Vermont's Constitution, which states, quote, "All persons are born equally free and independent and have certain rights amongst which are enjoying life and liberty and producing and obtaining happiness and safety." And again, Article 7, which I referenced earlier, which is our Common Benefits Clauses. Prop 5 is in keeping with the principles of liberty and freedom and equality reflected in Articles 1 and 7. At the same time, it does not mean that other rights afforded in the Constitution could not be used. So back to the language of the proposal, that one sentence. First of all, it's narrow in scope. It articulates a fundamental right to personal reproductive autonomy, a right that is central to the liberty to determine one's own life course, and one that cannot be achieved unless justified by a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. Now, some have questioned, these words don't mean anything. Where'd they come from? Well, the language comes directly from U.S. Supreme Court cases. For example, reproductive autonomy includes a bundle of rights that came from cases decided before and after Roe v. Wade. And they reference particularly what we mean, what is meant by the term reproductive autonomy. The right to choose or refuse contraception, the right to choose or refuse sterilization, the right to become pregnant, as well as the right to choose an abortion. At the same time, the Article 22 provides the standard by which the court will judge any action by the state, by government, to limit or restrict this right. And that standard is unless justified by a compelling state interest achieved by the least restrictive means. That's the same test that was used in Roe v. Wade, and it's which means that Vermont, the legislature, can in fact regulate this right for reproductive autonomy if there is a compelling interest. Some might argue that this is too high a bar, and I would respond by saying, looking at other Supreme Court cases that use the strict scrutiny, 1 in 3 are upheld. So it's not unheard of. And federal constitutional jurisprudence provides that fundamental rights, and that's what we were calling reproductive autonomy. Fundamental rights are entitled to the heightened protection against government interference through this due process clause, which I talked about earlier, when those rights are consistent with the ordered liberty or deeply rooted in a nation's history. So you go, what does this have to do with Vermont? Well, Vermont has a long history and tradition of embracing reproductive autonomy, including not restricting abortions. For more than the past 40 years, Vermont has chosen to not restrict an individual's access to abortion. Vermont has chosen to say that these very personal reproductive decisions are best made between an individual and her doctor. So I want to say, in conclusion, for those who say, why we do this, I'm going to say, while the right to reproductive autonomy, particularly abortion care, remains, and I would say for the time being, a fundamental right at the national level, as I showed you earlier, it has been and is under serious attack. And in this turbulent time, clarity is called for. The lack of a definitive enumeration of reproductive liberty in Vermont's Constitution, the threats that I outlined to Roe v. Wade being weakened or overturned by a very conservative U.S. Supreme Court, the cloud of multi-state efforts, the more than 400, to erode reproductive autonomy, all build a strong case for Prop 5. And then, just as important is our history in Vermont and support of freedoms included in reproductive autonomy. There should really be no question where Vermont stands with regard to its core values and commitment to fundamental rights. For those values and those rights to be protected definitively, they must be enshrined in our state constitution. And my support of Proposition 5 is because I think it is a fundamental right. That said, it's important to bring it to you, to all the voters in Vermont, to enable the voters to decide if personal reproductive autonomy is a fundamental right to the Vermont Constitution. I think it is. I hope the voters will agree, but it will be up to the voters to agree if in the next biennium both the Senate and House continue to pass on Proposition 5.
Hello, I'm Representative Ann Donahue. I represent Northfield and Berlin, the Vice Chair of the House Health Care Committee. And you know, a lot of times the political process gets disparaged, particularly when it gets down to very partisan fighting. Once in a while you have an example of our whole democracy really working well, the process doing what it's meant to do. And we had that happen in our committee last week. We had a very tough issue, and that is the issue of our health care information and the big government database. Probably many people are not aware that without your consent, automatically now, your electronic medical health records do go into a statewide database. Now, it was created on the premise that we were okay with putting all the records there because people would have the right to say whether or not those records could actually be accessed by anyone. In other words, you had to agree to let your providers or insurers, whoever needed the information, have access to it. Otherwise, it was locked off with the one exception of an emergency if people couldn't get your consent and they needed to have information. Of course, this is a really valuable system, not just for efficiency, but for safety, you know. Do you really remember your whole medication list when they say, and what medications are you on? A lot better if your, provider who's your referral can just access it online. But there was a fundamental rights issue here, and at the time it was set up, I was involved, and I said, you know, I don't think this system's going to work unless everybody has to be in it, unless they specifically say no. The default really has to be everybody in. And I think by creating it and saying that you will choose to enter into it, I think we're misleading the public as we establish this. And so I was really angry facing the point this year where everybody's saying it's got to change. The default has to be you are in the system as far as access by providers, only those who have a legitimate reason to be looking at it, but still, that you have to know enough to say, I don't want to opt out. But I also felt we did need to go there, but we need to take responsibility for the decision. And if we had done nothing, it would have gone to administrative functionaries to make that decision rather than the legislature. And we had a committee that was all over the map. People who said, I will never support a shift to an opt-out system. And others saying, come on, this isn't a big deal, as long as people are informed somehow. And we worked through listening to each other, listening to testimony, and really having a lot of good discussion, and came out to a place where we said, you know what? What's critical is that people absolutely know their right to say no. I'm not going to allow access to my records. And as long as we do that and we make it a careful process, people will actually be better informed than they are now. And people who want to be in the system will actually be able to be in it. Because right now, most people, a majority of people, haven't even been asked if they're willing to let their doctors have access. So we ended up, out of a very divided committee, coming out with an 11-0 vote, supporting a process that has, as we called it, lots of guardrails, to be careful, to do it right, to make sure people know their rights, but to also allow this system that is really about patient safety begin to be able to work the way it's intended.
Hi, I'm Dick McCormack, and I represent the Windsor County District in the Vermont Senate. That is to say, Windsor County, the Rutland County town of Mount Holly, and the Windham County town of Londonderry. And I serve in the mornings on Health and Welfare, and in the afternoon on the Appropriations Committee. We are, as I speak, we had second reading of the budget yesterday. And we'll be doing third reading today, which is to say the final passage of the Senate version of the budget. Invariably, the budget has a conference committee. Because we've made some amendments, and the House will want to discuss that. I'm looking forward to talking to my constituents when I go home about the budget, because what I would say is I voted for it. I voted for it proudly. I participated in writing it. I hate it. I hate it a lot, but I voted for it. What I hate it for is two things. Number one, it spends more money than the taxpayers want us to spend. And secondly, I hate it because it doesn't do nearly as much as we ought to be doing. And that sounds like a contradiction. I would quote Walt Whitman, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. The fact is we have needs that outstrip our financial capacity. And so what we do putting a budget together is deciding, okay, how much can we get, how little can we get away with? What do we have to appropriate so that the people get served properly, at least minimally properly? I came in this year with two particular priorities, one of which was parent-child centers. And I think we've done okay by them. There was a controversy that we're actually, this is good news, the number of people on Reach Up, the getting benefits, financial benefits based on their poverty, and then being in a program to help straighten their finances out. Number of people on Reach Up is going down. And the state has had a deal with the parent-child centers that the parent-child centers administer at least some of Reach Up and have addressed the needs of some of the people on Reach Up. And the state had suggested that we basically fire the parent-child centers, not because they've done a bad job, but because the demand has gone down. Many of us said, don't do that. The parent-child centers have dealt with us in good faith. They're our friends. They've done a good job. Don't fire them. The administration's answer then was, well, okay, in that case, we'll fire state workers. Which, of course, no one in the legislature suggested. And as happens in political discussions, it came out that we were demanding that state workers be fired. And we've been getting lots of angry, not lots, but some angry emails. And why do you want to fire state workers? And so I find after 30 years I have a 99% pro-labor voting record. No one remembers what I did wrong, why it's not 100%. Literally, no one remembers. But I have something like a 99. I'm making up the number. Maybe it's 95. It's it's a pro-labor record of which I'm proud. And now suddenly was being told I was being mean to the state workers. As it is, what we came down with is that if there are to be reductions in forces, some will be from the parent-child centers, some will be from the state, and probably there's other work that people can do. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that anybody needs to lose their job. The other priority that I had was what I refer to now. I'm getting quoted back to myself by my colleagues: the overarching existential crisis of our time, which is climate change. And once again, we're not doing what we need to do, but we're doing a lot more than I, for one, had great fears that we wouldn't be doing as much as we are doing. And we're addressing weatherization to conserve heating fuel, encourage various steps to encourage the electrification of the private car drivers, and also more freight being shipped by rail. We're expanding passenger rail. So I think we were actually doing quite a bit on climate, and I'm grateful for that. And I've made it clear that how grateful I am, in particular to Senate President Pro Tempore Ashe, and to the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Jane Kitchell, and to the whole committee, and to the Transportation Committee in the Senate. My brother Kurt chairs transportation in the House. I'm grateful to them. I think we've done a lot, and I'm going home feeling very proud about that. Having said that, when I was in high school, I remember I failed a math test, and my grandfather said, "You didn't study hard enough." And I said, "Grandpa, I did nothing all weekend but study. I just studied and studied and studied." And he said, "The measure of whether you studied enough, Dick, is not how hard you studied. The measure is the test. You failed the test. You didn't study enough." And I would say the same thing here with global warming, is we have not done enough. And that's not to say that I'm unappreciative of what has been done. I'm very grateful and respectful for what has been done. But we're contributing more atmospheric carbon now than we were 10 years ago. And we were supposed to be on a program moving towards 90% renewables by 2050, a promise I could make. I don't expect to live to be 115, so I can afford to make that promise. But we were supposed to be moving in that direction steadily, and we're actually not only not doing that, we're moving backwards. So we've got to really grab this issue for what it is. But we certainly got a good. Well, it's not a good start. We should have had a good start 30 years ago, and we did have a good start, albeit late, during the Shumlin administration. We've really got to get back on that program, and I think I have to get into the Senate and spend other people's money. Bye.
Hi, my name is Ruth Hardy. I am the junior senator from Addison County. We are outside on a beautiful day. It's really nice to be outside the building in the fresh air. So I was asked what is going on. It is the end of the session. Today on the floor, the Senate passed the budget on third reading, which is very exciting, the big bill as it's known. So that's going back over to the House, and I believe that the budget committees, the appropriations committees will be working on a conference committee on that, so I'm excited. It feels like good progress. I myself serve on the Agriculture Committee and the Education Committee, and we've basically finished most of our work, the bulk of our work. Morning committees in the Senate are not meeting anymore. We passed out our last bill in Agriculture today, and we are going to Conference Committee on our last bill for the Education Committee, which is the S40, the lead bill for testing drinking water in schools for lead. So I've been really happy with the work of both of my committees. I think we've done some great work, and I'm hoping that all of the bills that we worked on get over the finish line in the next week and a half, 10 days, or however much longer we have. The Senate made good progress today and yesterday on the floor. We had a 6.5-hour floor session yesterday and passed a lot of really important pieces of legislation, so I'm really pleased about that. And today I'm excited about the sunshine and the beautiful spring weather, and also the All-State Parade, which is happening today in Montpelier. This is a parade of high school and middle school students from all across the state who are converging on Montpelier for the All-State Music Festival, and the parade is the kickoff. I was told it's the longest running All-State Parade in the country, 92 years, and this is just the second time it's been here in our lovely state capital. So I'm excited to see the kids, including my own daughter, who's marching in the parade. So that's what I'm excited about today. Good work by the Senate, great work by my committees, and great, amazing kids from all over Vermont marching down in front of the State House in just a few hours. So that's what I've got for you, Rick. Thanks for having me on your show.
Hi, I'm Zachariah Ralph. I'm a representative in the Vermont House of Representatives, and I represent the towns of Heartland, Windsor, and West Windsor in Windsor 1 district. This is my first term in the House, and it's been a whirlwind of excitement, and I've heard it compared to another master's degree in public policy. I am currently on the Committee of Commerce and Economic Development. However, this is not my background. My background has been social and environmental activism. I've been knocking on doors in 5 different states, on 12 different campaigns and 8 different nonprofits. So I would say my expertise lays mostly in renewable energy, home efficiency, community gardens, and recycling, and not necessarily the things that we talk about in commerce and economic development, which include banking and insurance policies. However, I've very much enjoyed the committee because of the people that are in the committee, but also because I'm able to learn about a subject which I was not very familiar with. And it's been a really interesting sort of conversation that really does crisscross between how we develop the economy in our state, but also adapt and adjust to the threats from climate change. And so oftentimes in our committee and in other committees, the strongest voice and who the legislation or what the legislation would impact tends to be our small businesses. This is who we hear the most from in lobbyists and examples of why certain policies would negatively impact our economy and our small business in particular that would cause them to lose the state or for workers to lose their jobs. This in particular has been brought up quite a bit around the issue of minimum wage. But even our weatherization bill, which left the House, which adds a 2-cent fee onto fuel taxes, was heavily debated and was deemed as being regressive in that it would negatively impact low-income families who have to pay fuel subsidies. However, and that's a great example of how, when we look at the problems or the solutions for how we address climate change, it is oftentimes an investment into our future that in the short time costs us money, but in the long term actually saves us money. So when we are looking at energy policy, for example, and we decide to spend or invest millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, even $1 billion into making our state 100% dependent on clean, renewable sources of energy. That's a huge investment. Taxes would go up. But in the end, we would be creating a reliable source of energy that would keep energy dollars in the state, of which right now 100% are going outside of the state. So we could keep that money inside the Vermont economy, But also, since the 1980s, I believe there's been about a 300% increase on the cost of gasoline. So if we are transitioning to renewable energy or providing electric vehicle infrastructure for electric vehicles, we're actually creating stable costs for energy. So in the end, not only are we saving money in the state, but we're also saving money on our monthly bills for electricity and heating. So again, this is an example of how it's a long-term investment that saves Vermonters money. Same thing for weatherization. This is, or home energy efficiency. This is a really no-brainer and one of those low-hanging fruits of how we can address climate change but also build our economy. So when you live in a 3,000 square foot house and you're spending $300 to $400 a month on heating, but then you look at what happens if I weatherize? What if I make my house more energy efficient? And we create incentives to do those things to help Vermonters save money on their fuel costs. Then in the end, while there might be a large upfront cost, which not everybody can afford, understandably, in the end, that's money saved. And in some cases, it's money in your pocket every month, where the amount that you're paying to pay back for the weatherization upgrades is less than what you're actually saving on your heating. So it's been interesting to look at how economic development and sustainability are hand in hand, and we continue to look at solutions that combine those two things. And so my hope and my goal here at the State House is that we can move away from this idea that somehow putting additional costs or burdens on our small business will drive our economy into the dirt, but looking more forward to the future and understanding that we need to make these investments to keep people here in the state, to provide fundamental services that supply our youth as well as our senior citizens, but also prepare for us for the future. So that's my goal here, and I hope to find some success, but we'll see.